Mastodons frolicking in meadows and trees on the northern tip of Greenland, which is just 600 miles south of the North Pole. What today is a forbidding frozen wasteland was once a productive ecosystem. When, according to a paper published 2 weeks ago, about 2 million years ago. Interesting. But what if you were very interesting, but what if you were a young Earth creationist or are a young Earth creationist? The world is just a maximum of 6,000 years old, and a global flood destroyed the face of the Earth only about 4,350 years ago. Where exactly do mastodons and this ecosystem in which they resided fit into this very highly compressed history of the Earth? As I'm going to demonstrate, these mastodons must have lived after the flood, but prior to the Ice Age, which young Earth creationists do accept was a real historical phenomenon. That would place them in Greenland sometime between 4,350 years ago and 4,000 years ago. Is this realistic? How could they have migrated from the Middle East to this site so quickly? It's been suggested to me that millions of mammoths and mastodons living on the Earth shortly after the flood is no problem. Really? That is what we're here to find out. Coming up, what I think is a very serious problem for anyone wishing to compress the history of fossils and life into a 4,500-year time frame. All right, so what's up with this mastodon living all the way at the north end of Greenland? Well, if you're wondering what that's about, then obviously you haven't watched my previous video, which a week ago I talked about this paper from Nature, a 2 million-year-old ecosystem in Greenland uncovered by environmental DNA. But that's okay. You don't have to watch that to understand what I'm going to go through in this video. And if you want to explore the actual paper a little bit more, you can go to that other video. But here we're interested in the question, how in the world did they get there? Where did these mastodons come from? How did they get there? And especially in the context of young Earth creationism. So just a really quick capsule of what happened in that paper. Researchers went to the very northern tip of Greenland, to an area that is not completely ice covered all year round. And here's this barren, forbidden landscape. They dig into the side of the hill to the point where they get to the permafrost layers. And then they drilled into the permafrost and extracted organic material. So melted that permafrost soil, got the organic material out, extracted DNA from it. And from that, they discovered a whole ecosystem that once lived there and now is represented as the subfossils and the DNA that's left over. I want to show you that the tip what we're talking about is right up here. Let me get my pen out. So right up here is where we're talking about getting this. And this is only 600 miles from the North Pole. And 2 million years ago, it would have been about the same position. Greenland hasn't moved a whole lot. I want to remind you that during the last ice age, a good portion of North America was covered by a thick ice sheet. And so what we have left is this portion over Greenland, a little bit over portions of Canada. But in the past, Iceland would have been completely covered with this ice sheet. And so obviously an incredibly forbidden place at that time. Since then, the ice has been melting back and has exposed on this northern end of Greenland these sediments, all right, these layers of sediment that were deposited prior to this last ice age. All right, so this would be, we're looking back in time to a time before this portion of Iceland had been covered by ice. And at that time, it was a green, lush land. Again, these researchers think 2 million years ago, but as we're gonna ask the question now, for young Earth creationists, this can't be 2 million years ago. It has to be less than 6,000 years ago. In fact, it has to be less than 4,350 years ago, which would be their timing of when the flood covered the Earth. All right, so our question is, how did mastodons get to northern Greenland? How did they get there? Now, within the conventional viewpoint of the history of life on Earth, we'd say that there were a variety of different kinds of elephant types. And I'm just going to use the word elephant, even though pachyderm or proboscidean all right, would be a better word, encapsulating the whole family or order of organisms, of which there's a number of different varieties, and really only one of them should be properly called elephants. But just to make this simple, I will reference elephants as being the entire group of elephant-like things, and mastodons fit into that. So there would have been mammoths, right? Enormous numbers of mammoths living in Siberia, but also mammoths living in North America. I'm going to show you some of that data in a few minutes. On the order of millions and millions of individuals. Also mastodons living a little bit farther south, but as we can see, we're going to say that there's a mastodon or a group of mastodons that were living in northern Greenland at one time, and there are scattered evidence of them growing much farther north in other areas as well. But as we'll see, there are multiple species of elephant types living in South America, and of course many different kinds in Africa and in Asia. The only place that elephants are missing, all right, from the fossil record or living today would be Australia. So how did mastodons get to Greenland? Like a lot of other things would have gotten to Greenland. At times when the world was warmer, there still would have been separation of Greenland from everywhere else, but mammoths can swim. Mastodons presumably could swim too. And they could have lived on these northern islands and moved from one island to another and eventually made their way over to Greenland. And possibly they could have made it there too during an ice age, and maybe they walked across ice over to Greenland and were living in the southern part of Greenland where the edge is still available and there are plants living there even today in southern Greenland. And then when the world warmed at different times, they could migrate farther north, finding themselves in these locations at the very northern tip of the world. But the point is, if you have hundreds of thousands of years, you have lots of opportunities for organisms to move around from one continent to another as the ocean levels rise and fall. And so it's not a great difficulty to explain the great diversity of different elephant types in different parts of the world, and also the vast numbers of elephants that have lived in different parts of the world over long periods of time. So within the young Earth creationist model, of course, you only have sometime after the flood, you have all the different kinds of elephants living on the Earth, and they have to have gotten everywhere on the Earth. So the challenge is, if they started here, if we start with 2 elephants somewhere in the Ararat region in the Middle East, and they get off Noah's Ark, and they begin to walk away from the Ark, and they begin to reproduce, they're going to have to travel all the way across Asia, the land bridge, or swim. And they get all the way up, swim across to Greenland, and make their way up here. So these mastodons have to have traveled well over 10,000 miles in order to reach this point. And I'm giving away the big story here, and then we're going to get into some of the details. We're going to talk about population growth. We're going to talk about speciation. We're going to talk about a number of different things that would have had to have happened. But just the challenges of getting there are, I'll say, really great when you have a very, very limited time. And young Earth creationists have an extremely limited amount of time for them to get to Greenland, because they have to get to Greenland before it gets iced over. And in the young Earth creationist model, it gets iced over only a couple hundred years after the flood. So that's an extremely limited amount of time for both migration and for population growth. All right, so what are the questions that I have and others have for creationists with respect to this particular data point, these mastodons in Greenland? Well, how did they get there before the Ice Age? All right. We'll talk a little bit about what young Earth creationists think of when they think of the Ice Age, because they have a different thing in mind than the conventional view. Could populations of mastodons and other proboscideans reach their estimated sizes just a few hundred years after the flood? What about the numbers of mastodons and mammoths and other types of elephants that have lived on Earth? Is it possible that there could be as many, the population sizes could have been as large as has been estimated within a creationist view? And did elephants exist before the flood? I think we really have to answer that question as well in order to accentuate the difficulty of explaining the fossils, the elephant fossil record. All right, so here's some things that we're going to need to discuss in order to get to some of these questions. First, we have to look at what is the fossil record of proboscideans. So I'm going to give you a general overview of that. What's the maximum growth rate for an elephant population? I've published a peer-reviewed paper on mammoth population growth, and it's actually an educational paper, and I'm going to actually track you through it and talk about my co-author and I's thoughts as we develop that particular paper and why we did, because it actually has to do with young Earth creationists. It's this question that we're looking at today that actually inspired us to write that particular paper, even though that paper never discusses young Earth creationism or has anything to do directly with young Earth creationism. What limits are there on elephant population growth? So what might cause elephant populations not to grow as fast as they theoretically could? How many species of proboscideans are there? All right, and are they all the same kind? In other words, are they all related to an arc pair? Were there only 2 elephant types on the arc that gave rise to mastodons, mammoths, and the other elephants? And we'll see the diversity of elephants in a moment. All right, so let's start with what is the fossil record of proboscideans. So I'm going to do this in a very simple way. We're going to use the Paleo database. And there's the address. And if you've never been to this site, paleobiodb.org, I really encourage you to check it out. It's a great place to get good information about where fossil sites are, stuff from the literature. This is going to miss a lot of sort of colloquially known fossil sites, but this would be from published literature, and it doesn't even cover all the published literature. But nonetheless, it has a enormous collection, a database of fossil sites. And so what I've done here is I've just selected out a few keywords to search for in the database and have it tell me and show me where fossils have been found. So if I just go in and I just click on, I want to look at the Phanerozoic, and I want to look at Proboscidea, which is the order of all the elephant types, and ask where in the world do we find elephant fossils across time, from 550 million years all the way to present. In other words, the bulk of what most of us would think of as the geological column. And you just say, okay, I'm going to give you the whole geological column. Where do we find them on the surface of the Earth? Where have we collected them? And you see all these dots all over the place, right? We have dots in South America, North America, Asia, Africa, but notably no dots are found in Australia. So there is no fossil record, no known fossil record of any form of elephant in Australia. Great. That's really not terribly informative. This is saying like across the entire geological column. Now we want to home in on, well, what parts of the geological column do we actually find elephant fossils? So let's get a little more specific. Let's go back to the Mesozoic. All right. And remember, the Mesozoic is the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, which is colloquially known, generally known as the age of the dinosaurs. Right. This is the only ages in which you find dinosaur fossils, and parenthetically also the sea reptiles and pterosaurs. And so if you go to so we look at the Mesozoic and we ask, well, where are elephant fossils found in Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rocks? And what you should notice here is there are no dots. Okay, there's not a single dot. There's not a single elephant fossil known from the Mesozoic. I'm not showing you the Paleozoic, right, which is the Cambrian up through the Permian. And because it's the same thing, there are no known fossils of dinosaurs. All right, so the first thing you should get from this is that if you look at the breadth of the geological column, the majority of it, 2/3 to 3/4 of that geological column, is utterly lacking in any kind of elephant fossils. Why is that important? All right, that's important for a couple different reasons. One is, I'll say this, is that young Earth creationists believe that all different forms of life, all right, all different kinds of living things were created all at the beginning at the same time. So they're all contiguous, right? They all should be present with each other. And so prior to the flood, all right, the global flood, there should have been elephants living during that time, in which case when the flood destroyed the world, because Noah had to have taken 2 of those elephants and preserved them on the ark. When the flood came, any elephants that weren't on the ark should have been destroyed and then preserved in the fossil record, just like all those different dinosaurs, right? So we have 1,000 different sorts of dinosaurs, and we find their bones all over the place. You might expect that elephants, also being large-bodied organisms, might live in similar locations to dinosaurs, and so wherever you see dinosaurs preserved, you might also expect to find elephants preserved. Like that would be my guess prior to looking at the data, right? If I was thinking from a young Earth creationist perspective, that's what I would expect to see. But no elephants known. No elephants before the flood. Now I'm saying let's move on here. So let's move into the Cenozoic. All right, the Cenozoic is the period after the Cretaceous all the way to the present. That's 66 million years ago, all the way to the present. And we're splitting the Cenozoic up into different periods in there. Okay. And so let's look at the Paleogene. The Paleogene is 66 million to 23 million years. So rocks dated to those ages. And now we've got some dots showing up, right? And so we have these orangish dots representing Paleozoic sites that have been dated to that age. And let me circle roughly the range of where you'll find these fossils. So there you go. All right, so that's where we find elephant fossils, the very first elephant fossils that show up in the oldest rocks. Now, the Paleogene is thought by many young Earth creationists, and I'll say that's the majority view in young Earth creationism, to be post-flood rocks, right? It's after the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, which a lot of creationists see as being the flood boundary, meaning that's the end of the flood and the beginning of the period after the flood. And so these rocks would be formed after the flood, and so it have organisms trapped in them that were descendants of animals that got off the ark. And so these would be elephants that are the descendants of the two elephants that walked off the ark. And in this way, this kind of makes sense. You could point to this as a young Earth creationist and say, look, see, I just drew a circle around basically the Middle East. And if Noah's Ark landed there, that would be the origin point, right? The starting point for really all land animals, right? Land vertebrates. They're going to radiate out from the Middle East. And here we see it, right? In the oldest rocks that are still after the flood, we find these elephants are only preserved in this particular area. There aren't any in North America. There aren't any in South America. Now let's move forward a little bit. Oh, I do want to point out that in the Paleogene, that's split into different periods. And we have the Eocene. It's really not until the Eocene that the first elephants show up. There's none in the Paleocene. And so it's not all the way back to 66 million years. It's more like 45 million years. That's when you first start seeing some elephants. And those elephants are very different than the types of elephants that you would know today. So we're not talking about Loxodonta, all right, which is the African elephant. There'd be nothing like that. It'd be a much smaller animal that had other elephant-like features. All right, so then let's move up into the Neogene of the Cenozoic, and that is from 2.58 million years to around 22 million years. And now what you see dots all over the map, right? There actually are a couple here in South America, not very many, but we see a huge number in Europe, and then of course a lot in North America. But it extends all the way out into Asia, all the way over to Japan and so forth. All right, and then off into a lot of the islands of the Indonesian islands and Malaysia and so forth. You might be wondering, like, how did they get to some of those more remote islands? You have to remember that during past ice ages, and the thing is, conventionally, it's thought that there have been multiple ice ages, not just one ice age. But in some past ice age, the Earth's ocean levels were much lower, and most of those Indonesian islands were connected. And so elephants could walk out there and then get isolated on those different islands. And then if we move to the Quaternary, which is the period that we're in right now, 2.58 million years to present. So this is the very, very upper crust, all right, of sediments that have been laid down on Earth. And fossils found in those are very, very young. And now we see that, yes, there's still all kinds of, especially in North America, massive numbers of fossil sites. And these are only Quaternary sites now I'm showing you. So you can see in North America, there's different layers of sediment that contain mastodons and mammoths. In some cases, there's more mastodons, and sometimes there's more mammoths. There's changes in the distribution of these different animals over time. And what we also have is we have a large number of fossil sites found in South America as well, and there's even more far north in Siberia and so forth, and in northern Canada. So lots and lots of elephants distributed across the face of the earth. But of course, today, where are they? All right, we've got elephants here, and we have elephants here, essentially. And that's it. All right, they've gone extinct everywhere else. So multiple species have gone extinct, and lots of individuals have gone extinct. There's only about 370,000 African elephants alive today. That's down from 1 million or 2 just 50 years ago. And if you go back to the 1800s, it's thought there may have been as many as 20 million alive at one time in the 1800s. And if you go before that, well, then you would have even more than that, especially since if you go thousands of years back and you have elephants all over the face of the earth, some estimates are that there's, 100 million or more elephants in total, across all different populations alive at any one moment in time. All right. So what about the diversity of these? So mostly what I'm talking about is just all the members of the proboscideans, right? All proboscideans collectively, here's their fossil record. So there are none prior to 65 million years ago. And then even after that, there aren't any until about 40 million years ago. And that's when you see the very first proboscideans, and there's just a couple, right? 1 or 2 species, and they're actually fairly small species. You see these down here? These are the early ones here. And those small species, then later there are larger species, and there's a large variety of different species of elephants. There's short-tusked ones, there's straight-tusked elephants, there's there's the mammoths, which have the huge curly tusks. There are 4-tusked mammoths. There are ones that have tusks on the bottom jaw versus ones on the top jaw, and so forth. And then you have the gomphotheres, which are in South America, which have these weird extensions on their jaw and have teeth at the end. They're kind of like shovels. So there's a great morphological variety, and overall, from the fossil record that I just showed you over 40 million years, or the conventionally speaking, there's been identified more than 150 distinct species of proboscideans. All right, and yet we only have 3 alive today. All right, so the world is rather depauperate of proboscideans compared to the past, when they were far more abundant and more diverse. And so that again begs a question like, for young Earth creationists, what would that diversity profile look like? Like today there's only 3. How far back would you have to go before you had 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 different species alive at one time? Or is it possible that maybe all 150 species were alive at one time? And if the 150 species were all alive at one time, but if you go back 4,350 years ago to Noah's Ark, there would have been only 1 species. In fact, there would only been 2 individuals total of all proboscideans. This is working within the model that they're all one kind of organism. I'll touch upon the other hypothesis, which is that there might be multiple different types of proboscideans that are not related to one another. But again, the popular view among young Earth creationists is that there's really only one kind of elephant, and it was represented by just 2 individuals on the ark. And so if that's the case, then you need to find a way, young Earth creationists need to find a way to derive, all right, create 150 species or more, but then have 147 of them go extinct soon afterwards. And you don't have a whole lot of time to work with, because 145 of them must have gone extinct at or before the Ice Age. And as we're going to see, the Ice Age is very soon after the flood. So this greatly limits the time span in which young Earth creationists can work to both derive new organisms and to cause their extinction. A little bit more on diversity. Much of the diversity is not just about tusks in size, but it's also about teeth. And teeth say a lot about what they eat. And so Different tooth forms are related to different forms of browsing or grazing, different food sources. And so different elephants specialized on different food sources. Many of these we know pretty well what they ate because of the dental hygiene, the bits of pieces of plant material that got stuck in their teeth we've analyzed, which we can even do with DNA now. And so we have a good idea, like here are the species of plants that these organisms were eating. We also have their feces in many cases, and we can dissect their feces, their preserved feces, and actually count up the types of plants that they ate from that as well. But the other reason I'm showing you this is, and this figure comes from the rise and the fall of Proboscidean ecological diversity, which is looking at sort of the grand history of proboscideans and how they diversified and then eventually lost diversity. And that's what this figure right down here is. It's just showing there are really no proboscideans, and then you first see proboscideans in the fossil record. And then they begin to diversify. There's more species, and then there's a whole lot more species at one point. And then they begin to gradually decline to the point where they are today. And so the fossil record suggests not a instantaneous loss of species, but rather a general decline of species over time. And then what this figure up here shows is these are the different kinds of teeth we have here. And so your modern elephant is right here. And this one right here is mastodon. I'm sorry. I think this one's the mastodon, the nipple tooth one. And it has a very different tooth pattern, and they were more grazers rather than, more browsers than they were grazers. So rather than eating grasses and things like that, they were more like eating leaves off of trees and so forth. And so if you look at the tooth type in all these different fossils, and that's what's well known for the fossils, the ivory, the tusks, the heads, the skulls are some of the better preserved things, but especially the teeth. And so they can look at these tooth types. And if you look at the tooth types of the very first elephants that are these smaller animals, they exist through time for a while, but eventually they peter out and they don't exist anymore. So they go extinct. And then if you look at the tooth types of, say, Dinotherium is one of my favorites because they have these crazy backwards facing tusks. And we're an absolutely enormous animal compared to today's elephants. They persist for quite a long time. And then there are the mastodons and so forth. And these various tooth types exist in the species over long stretches of time, and they become more common in more species, and then eventually extinction happens. And for most of them, these are all extinct, right? All these met their end somewhere, and we only just really have today's variety of elephants. All right, so that is saying that what I'm showing you here is that there is a wealth of diverse characteristics among the elephant group. And that diversity, though, is spread out in a kind of a pattern over time in the fossil record. So now if we take a snapshot of like what would diversity look like maybe 50,000 to 10,000 years ago in the conventional dating, and this would be really during the last ice age. Okay, you have sort of it reaches its kind of end max point at like 18,000 years ago. It's waning to about 10,000 years ago, and then after that we consider that post ice age times. So even as recent as 50,000 to 10,000 years, there were elephants living in all of these places. Right? South America had these gonfaloniers. North America had both mammoths and mastodons. Asia had mammoths, and down here, and this is a bunch of different kinds of mammoths, and then other forms of elephants that are like our modern elephants today, Elephas. All right, so a large number of species, upwards of maybe 15 different species alive at one time on the Earth, as recently as the last ice age. And so over a very short period of time, we have lost most of that diversity and are left with just 3 species, 2 of which are in Africa, and a lot of people have a hard time distinguishing from each other. So you probably think of just 2 species. All right, now let me come back to the point about that's a lot of diversity. And you might be thinking to yourself, where did all that diversity come from? For a young Earth creationist, where does all that come from? How does that come to be? Ken Ham has said multiple times, and this is basically the position of Answers in Genesis, which is the largest young Earth creationist apologetics ministry, and has the largest sway. So I'm going to say this is the majority view among, I'll say, professional creationists, but also among lay creationists, the person who just believes in young Earth creationism. They would look at Ken Ham, and Ken Ham tells them, look, there's an elephant kind, all right, called the Proboscideae. All right, he accepts that sort of classification of that order, which includes multiple families. And then what he's showing here is from this elephant kind, each one of these kinds are things that God made. God made a cat kind, a dog kind. And each one of those was represented on Noah's Ark by two individuals. Those two individuals get off the ark, and then they diversify, and that's what these lines are showing, into various things. So, for example, the canines diversify into different kinds of foxes and other kinds of wolves. And the wolves then diversify into, coyotes and wolves, and then eventually into domesticated dogs. But they're all the same kind of organism, and therefore they all had to have formed after the flood, right? All that diversity is all just an outgrowth of two individuals. So he says the same thing is true for the elephant kind, right? He takes the elephant kind and he says, look, you've got the elephant kind divides into one group, which are the mastodons, because they have these different kinds of teeth. And there's a few other differences in their anatomy. And then you've got the other elephants, the Elephantidae, which then becomes things like mammoths and then Loxodonta, and Loxodonta then becomes two species, which are the African forest elephant and the African bush elephant. All right, so here's your living elephant, this is a living elephant, and this is the Asian elephant. Those are your three living elephants. But all of these things, he would say, are all one kind, so therefore came from just two individuals. Now, what I'm stressing here, which he doesn't do, he's noting the famous extinct elephants that like everybody has heard of from the last ice age. But what he's not talking about, and he's not telling his audience, is there's 150 other species, all right, of elephant types that are at least as divergent and different as the ones that people think of normally. And so that's a tremendous amount of diversity, but he would say all that comes from just two individuals that came off the ark. So we're going to have to find a way to accommodate all that variation. At the same time, we're figuring out how they're going to migrate across the earth and become the populations where they are. And then we have to figure out the timing, like how did they get there in the short amount of time available to them before they had to go extinct. Because we know that many of these species were extinct long before any person came along to that same location, and people have been pretty much everywhere on the earth since only a few hundred years after the flood. So we're working in an extremely limited window of time to explain both migration or biogeography patterns, and to explain total population numbers, and to explain the diversity of the elephants as well. Okay, so now we have to discuss this biblical ice age thing. All right, you have to understand a little bit about what young Earth creationists think about when this ice age occurred, because all young Earth creationists that I've ever met do accept that there was an ice age, that it was a real phenomena, that there was large amounts of ice on the earth that covered a large portion of North America and Asia and Europe. And so since they accept that physical evidence, there really isn't biblical evidence. Now, I will say that they will point to some biblical evidence, but that is really a case of they're convinced that there was an ice age based on the physical evidence, based on the science. And so they take that and they look back into the Bible and see if they can find any scraps of evidence from the Bible that suggests there was an ice age. I don't think anybody would read the Bible, or anyone has read the Bible in the past before they knew about ice ages from science, and thought, oh, there's an ice age. All right, that's an afterthought. And so they accept the science of an ice age, but they don't accept is the abundant evidence that there's been multiple ice ages that have occurred intermittently through Earth's history. They don't have time. They don't have room for that, right, in the biblical time scale. Because in their chronology, all the evidence of an ice age is all at the surface, mostly on the surface of the Earth. Therefore, all that is post-flood, which means it has to be within the last 4,500 years. And it can't be within like the last 3,000 years because people have been all over the place and not seen these giant, mile-thick layers of ice in North America 3,000 years ago. So there's only room for one ice age. And so they call that the biblical ice age. This is a figure from a paper from Answers in Genesis. The paper is titled, "When Was the Ice Age in Biblical History?" And in this figure, here they're showing, look, all this area was covered in North America. Oh, and notice Greenland, all right? Greenland is 100% covered with ice at this particular time. And then on here, they're talking about, well, how did people come to America? Well, they migrated across the land bridge between Siberia, all right, and Alaska. And then they came down into North America and eventually made their way down into South America. And then when the ice melted, they made their way all the way to the bottom of South America. Now, the most important thing here is, when did that happen? When did that happen? So here at the bottom of that same figure is the timeline. And I've seen this timeline repeated in multiple places at Answers in Genesis. This is their general timeline that they use. And I know that they'll say that this is a hypothesis, but this is what they present to their audience. They'll say, hey, look, we've got the flood. And you notice I've been using the word 2,350 years BC. And the reason I use that is because that's the number that they frequently use as being the target date for that's when the flood ended. And so they would say 2,350 BC. What happened after that? Well, they're saying, look, you got forest in Antarctica. Right after that, it was fairly warm. They admit there was a lot of volcanic activity during the global flood, and therefore the water in the oceans was quite warm. The earth was very, very warm after the flood. All right, it's not cold at all. All right, all the way to the poles. And so they're saying, look, you can see in Antarctica evidence that there were forests there. So they do see that evidence. They feel like they need to explain it. They say, well, we can explain it because after the flood it was warm, and there was a forest that quickly grew up in Antarctica. And so this is first generation, second generation, third generation. We get to about the time of Babel. That's the time when all people collected in one place. And they would propose that everyone, not just some individuals of Noah's descendants, but they would say all Noah's descendants gathered together in the Middle East at Babel. And that's a really important distinguishing thing, because that means everyone where they're at now is basically coming from Babel and migrating out to that point. All right, now notice that you say first mastodons. Now, I'm not exactly sure why, but they're saying like 100 years after the flood, that's when you first see the first mastodons. Part of that might be because they don't think that mastodons were on the ark. They think that there was a basic elephant kind. It was probably more like our African elephants, although maybe smaller. And they got off the ark, and then they start to populate, and then eventually there are some of them that turn into mastodons, right? Some of them have different forms that we could call the ancestors of mastodons. And that's 100 years after that. Remember this number, because we're going to look at population growth in detail, and we're going to ask ourselves, could that actually happen? All right? How many actual elephants would there be on the earth 100 years after the flood? Or put another way, how many elephants were on the earth, according to young earth creationists, 2,250 years ago? Or 2,275 years ago, I guess is what this is. So they're saying first mastodons here, and then they're also pointing here to first woolly mammoths. Mastodons are generally considered in the fossil record to be older than mammoths, even though they live contemporaneously. The mastodons were around earlier, and then mammoths joined the party. And they both lived in some of the same areas at the same time. And so I guess they're acknowledging that by saying that woolly mammoths don't show up till later. So this is part of this diversification. But notice, woolly mammoths show up when the Ice Age is beginning. All right, so they say the Ice Age began about 100 years after the flood, 100 years. So 100 years later, the Ice Age begins. Now, what happens at the Ice Age is, of course, water is being deposited on the land in the form of ice. So therefore, it's taken out of the ocean. So the ocean was higher before, higher than it is today, because there wasn't any ice. Now, currently, there's a lot of ice on the Earth still, right? And if you melted it all, boom, water would be up 100 feet. So they're saying that before that, there was more water. That water's taken off, and it's beginning to pile up on the continents. So ocean levels are lowering. And then they had to say, oh, the mammoths spread that time, right? First woolly mammoths in North America. They're saying like right here, like the water has gone down enough that you can form a land bridge, or at least the land is close enough that maybe they could swim the last 100 miles and they could get from Asia to North America. And that's how they entered into North America. Because remember, they all had to start in the Middle East and they're having to migrate out. So they've migrated to Siberia, and now they're spreading around Siberia, and eventually they get into North America during the peak of the Ice Age. That's when it becomes available. And then here you see humans entering America. So they think it was only about 300 years, 200, 225, 250 years after departing the Ark. Human beings are crossing over that Bering Strait during the Ice Age, the biblical Ice Age, and then coming into North America. So they're coming essentially with the mammoths, and presumably mastodons as well, right? Mastodons are also entering into North America at this time. All right, and then the Ice Age is over, 2000 BC, right? So 2350 to 2000 is only 350 years. So in 350 years, you had a warm ocean, and you had forest growing all over the place, all the way down to Antarctica. And here's where we get to the Greenland thing coming in, right? When was Greenland green? Greenland was green for the first 100 years or so after Noah's flood. So flood happens, there's this naked land, and plants begin to grow on it. And then you have rabbits and wolves, and then eventually mastodons and other things that are living in Greenland. All those organisms, all those animals had to get there, all right? Well, let's just talk about animals because they're migrating from the Middle East. All the vertebrates that are there had to migrate from the Middle East and get to Greenland while it was green in order to enjoy, the food that was available there and the climate. They all had to get there in that first 100 years, because after the first 100 years, it starts to get cold and ice begins to get deposited on the land. And where's it going to get deposited? Wow, northern end of Greenland, for sure, really early on. All right, that's going to be one of the first places, is that very northern part. And so here's the problem, right? I hope it's starting to come clear, and it'll become more clear when we look at the population growth models. These mastodons are found. The evidence of their remains, all right, in this case, their DNA, but along with all the other plant material that was there at the same time, is all found in layers of sediment that are underneath what was the last Ice Age's ice. And for young Earth creationists, that would be the biblical Ice Age, right? Ever since the biblical Ice Age, the northern part of Greenland has not been green, right? It's been extremely cold, and it's only just now warming up to any extent. And so when did those organisms live there? They had to have lived there before the Ice Age. Not getting there during the Ice Age, because once the Ice Age begins, it's cut off from their ability to survive there. So it had to be extremely early. So right away, we can see there's a problem here. Okay, maybe the first mastodons are here. Then they migrated to Greenland here in the next 50 years. And then they lived there for 10 years. And then the ice covered them up. But mammoths, well, how did they get to North America? How could they get there before the Ice Age? Before the Ice Age, there is 800 miles of water between Asia and North America. An extremely large amount of water there. Remember that the water's higher then than it is now. So as much water there is there now, there's even more before. And all those islands up there in Canada, they're even more separated from each other. They're smaller islands with more water between them. And so they're having to move from one island to another. That's an arduous journey. And they had to do it on this particular graphic here, they're doing it in just a few decades. Okay, so I meant to have this up here when I was talking about this. So we start out, we've got an elephant here, 2 elephants right here, right? And let me hit the general problems again. Mastodons have to move all the way across here, over here, up here, across all these islands, and eventually find their way to a happy meadow here in northern Greenland. But at the same time, if you have 2 elephants and they get off the ark and they start walking, and let's say in the first year they walk a couple hundred miles, the 2 elephants together, and then they have a baby. All right, so now they have 3. There's 3 elephants. But it's going to be another 5 years before they have another baby. All right, so in those 5 years, sure, like theoretically, they could walk a lot of miles. Like they could walk this far. All right, and then they have, so now they've got 4. There are 4 elephants together, so after 10 years, right, we still only have 4 or 5 total elephants. And if they're mastodons, that's one thing. But remember, at the same time, we got to come up with mammoths. We got to come up with African elephants. We got to come up with Asian elephants. We got to come up with Gulfamirs have to get down here. And then there's another genus of elephants that's primarily on the other side of North America. We got to get our mammoths over here as well. We got to get our dinotheriums, and we got to spread them all over here. They have to go in every single direction. So whatever elephants got off the ark, the 2 of them can't spend the next 20 years making a beeline for North America. Because if they do, they're going to get to North America as a group. And then they're going to have to, few of them are going to have to leave the herd, and they're going to have to migrate back to Africa from there. All right, so remember, you got to generate 150 different species. And only the mastodons, only a little bit of that population, which would be the mastodons, are going to get to Greenland. And of course, there's 100 other locations mastodons were as well in this area, probably thousands, but hundreds that we know of. And that constitutes a large population, and all of those went extinct before the last ice age. So we have to accommodate that entire population just of mastodons, much less accommodate hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of dinotheriums, because there's a lot of fossils of dinotheriums over a large area. And then, of course, all the other types of elephants. Wow, it's a daunting prospect. And it's not that Young Earth Creationists haven't ignored this. Here's Nathaniel Jeanson, resident developmental biologist at Answers in Genesis. He writes this in a paper about how quickly you could make and populate the world. Given the other known population growth parameters, the elephant population size can grow quickly. Under these parameters, which he explains are like how long it takes to have a baby, how long it takes to wean, and growth rates and so forth. After 50 years, the population size would be 35 individuals. So he's saying after 50 years after the flood, you would have, starting out with 2, you would have 35 elephants. 35 total elephants after 50 years. He's right. That's a modest amount. Now, I'm going to quibble with this 35 because I don't think it's even 35. I'm going to say it's 22. I'll get to that in a moment. After 100 years, it would be approximately 750 individuals. All right. Again, nothing spectacular. I'm gonna say that it's about 200 individuals after 100 years. But after 200 years, you have 300,000 elephants that would exist. And after 300 years, well, then, of course, you'd have 163 million individuals. This is exponential growth, and exponentials grow fast. By 500 years after the flood, 35 trillion elephants would roam the earth. In 1,000 years, 2 elephants could produce the population size of 8 times 10 to the 26, which is 10 times with 26 zeros after it, which is a mind-boggling number, right? Now, obviously, that doesn't really happen in the real world because there are constrictions on population growth. Eventually, populations have problems continuing their growth because they can run out of food, right? You get too many individuals in one location, there's not enough food for all of them to eat. They're not all going to be able to continue to reproduce as quickly as they were before. And there's a whole bunch of other things that create what's called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the number of individuals that a particular environment can actually reliably handle. And so you reach a point where there is as many dying as there are being born. And at that point, your population doesn't increase anymore. And so that's something that ecologists study a lot, is there is a carrying capacity for all species to some extent. And so what's the carrying capacity of elephants? Well, it's certainly quite high, actually, in the order of, I'm sure the world could have 100 billion elephants alive at any one point in time, although maybe not with human beings on the earth at the same time. All right, now that brings me to this paper. And I wanted to talk about this for a few minutes, and not just what the paper says, but how the paper came to be. The paper is Pleistocene Preserve, a population growth problem of mammoth proportions. And you'll see the authors, Thomas Beatman and Robert Joel Duff. And Joel Duff is me. Thomas Beatman, by the way, is my previous PhD student, doctoral student, who does have a PhD now, from my lab. And he and I talked a lot about elephants. He was really fascinated with elephants, as was I. And we've been thinking about this whole issue of population growth with respect to just what I'm talking about now, which is how would you get two elephants to turn into all the different kinds of elephants that young Earth creationists have? And Thomas Beatman created quite an extensive spreadsheet and created a couple different mathematical models for modeling population growth based on the different parameters that we know of from living elephants in terms of their growth rates. So what is the theoretical maximum growth rate, which is what I'm going to show you in a moment. And then you have to consider all the other variables. And so it's not actually going to be the theoretical max. There's going to be other issues that cause populations not to grow as fast as they theoretically could. And so this paper really was an outgrowth of our thinking about young Earth creationism and the challenge to young Earth creationism. But in the end, the paper says nothing about young Earth creationism. And it is a teaching model on just what exponential growth is, all right, and how to sort of get a grasp on how exponential growth works, and to get students to think about if exponential growth occurs, like what eventually will happen to populations. And so asks them a series of questions about final outcomes. And I think the premise of the paper was kind of cute. It was, we said, rather than thinking about Noah's Ark and then like, okay, so now from Noah's Ark to today, how would you get all the elephants? What we did was we put it in the perspective of de-extinction. All right, this idea that people want to bring back mammoths, right? And we said, what if we really did? Let's just say that we really were able to make a mammoth. And more importantly, make two mammoths, a male and a female. So you start out with just two mammoths. Oh, you see the connection? All right. On the ark, there's two mammoths or two elephants. All right. So let's say you had these two and they're in a zoo. And, everybody's flocking to that zoo because, you got to see this extinct organism. It's alive again. You can actually see woolly mammoths. So it's a super popular exhibit. And every other zoo in the world also wants to have their own mammoths. So, and so there's a program set up. They're like, we're going to provide mammoths for all the other zoos. And so Thomas came up with he actually got the list of like how many different zoos there are and how many different zoos could handle like elephants, like to try to make this realistic. Like here's like how many actual available places there would be to place a pair of mammoths. And then we asked the question, how long would it take for all those zoos to have what they want, which is a pair of mammoths? It's really a question of population growth. And the question is, how many years you're going to have to wait? I'm sorry to tell you the end of the story. It's a long time. It's going to take a while. It's not like this isn't a project you do so that your kids can see a mammoth in any zoo, right? This is so your great-great-great-great-great-grandkids might be able to see a mammoth in any zoo that they go to. So the question then becomes, how fast can they populate? How fast can they reproduce? And then the other parameters are, of course, to reproduce, you also have to have males and females. And then you're going to have to then split them off into different places and restart population growth in each of those locations. So, all right, so splitting populations and then creating more individuals till you get enough that you can split them off and put them in other zoos. And so here's how it works. We developed basically created a board with manipulatives, all right, little cubes, and the cubes represent a mating pair. And so, for example, at 10 years, you could say you have a mating pair that's 10 years old and no others. And then 4 years later, population, 0 year, they're 10 years old. And 10 years later, you're going to have some that are age 0 because they're going to give birth. And you're going to give 2 birth over 10 years because it's about every 5 years. It's 2 years, all right, inside the womb to make an elephant. Almost 2 years, like 22 months. And then after they're born, it's 2.5 to 3 years to wean an elephant and then become eligible to become pregnant again, which may take up to a year to get pregnant again. And so you're looking at a 4.5 to 5 year turnaround between each offspring. And most elephants, living elephants today, have 1 offspring per mother. There are twins, but those twins are only 1 out of every 100 births. And twins have extra challenges, and they would be extra challenging in a herd. And so aren't necessarily a good thing to have a twin in terms of population growth. So it's kind of not a net gain to have twins necessarily. So it's best just to think of it as like 1 every 5 years. All right. And so what we have to do is I'm not going to show this. We create this board and you basically move the little cubes around. And as they move to different years, every 10 years, that's an interval where you're going to have 2 more births. And we said, let's assume you have a male and a female. All right, I'm going to be more generous to young Earth creationists. I'm going to say, what if we have 2 females for every 3 born? Because more females means more potential for population growth. I mean, the males aren't really that important. Males play an important role in terms of herd dynamics and some other things, maybe a little bit of protection for the herd. But basically, 1 male can do the job, for a lot of females. And so you don't need 1 male for each female. But let's say, for every 10 years, you have a male and a female. That's going to be a breeding pair 13 or 14 years later, because it's going to take at least 13 years before the females become ready to have their own babies. So you have to wait that long before they can begin to have offspring. And so you move the little manipulatives around and they keep reproducing. And eventually after age 50, most elephants aren't going to be reproducing. And so although they may live till they're 60 or 75, especially males, they're not really doing anything in terms of reproduction. So effectively, you can think of them as being dead. I know that sounds terrible, but if you're not reproducing, you're not really part of population growth anymore. All right. And so those disappear from the population. So you're subtracting members of the population as well as adding new members to the population. And as long as all the females are all having a new baby every 5 years, the population is going to continue to increase, right? Because there's going to be more births than deaths. And so that's where you get your population growth from. And so we have this, by the way, this paper has supplemental files and you can download all these and you can do the learning exercise yourself. This was made to be like a lab. Right, for a class, for high school or college, as a lab you can do. We have an instruction set and how to do it and what to do and what are the questions you could ask them. We have an answer sheet for it. All right, an instructor's guide. So we have this population growth figure in which they're going to map their data that they get from using their manipulatives. Okay, I'm going to do this in a verbal form rather than show you the manipulatives. So calculating population growth of elephants. So let's say there's 2 pachyderms, right? 2 elephants on Noah's Ark 4,500 years ago. Now I'm going to stress the number 2. This would not be the 2 elephants entered the Ark. This would not be an elephant plus a female elephant that's pregnant. It can't be a pregnant elephant because if there was a pregnant elephant on board, that pregnant elephant would technically be another individual, right? I mean, all younger creationists would say that life begins at fertilization. That's not just for human beings. That's for elephants too. And so if 2 elephants were brought to the ark, they couldn't be a pregnant one. And this is important for the population thing because if you said that they were pregnant, then they could have had one on board, and that gets you started on your population growth a little bit earlier. So not pregnant when they get on the ark. They could get pregnant on the ark, though. All right, and I'm going to assume that. We're going to take the best case scenario we can for younger creationists to get the largest population size the earliest possible. So female gets pregnant soon after entering the ark. Now the ark is it's a year, a little less than a year. And it's going to take 2 years, though, to develop that fetus into and birth. So 1 year after departing the ark, best case scenario, the female delivers her first offspring, and we're going to say it's a female. All right, and it's important that it's a female because then you're going to more quickly get to the point where you're going to have 2 females that can give birth, right? If it's a male, if they have 2 males in a row and that takes 10 years, you're looking at a long lag before you're able to actually start adding 2 individuals to the population every 5 years. So until then, you're only adding 1 individual to the population until you have 2 females that are capable of having offspring. So let's say there's a female. So after a year, there are 3 elephants on the face of the earth. All right, there are 3. So 3 years to wean and then 2 years of pregnancy, which adds another 5 years. So 6 years after the ark, we now have another offspring being born. And let's say it's another female, right? We're going to go for the fastest population growth possible. And so we have to hope that all these things work out. Another female is born. And so now we have 4 elephants after 6 years, right? So this is 5 years of 3 elephants wandering around. 3 elephants are making their way in the world. 2 elephants and a baby. And they're by themselves. That's a challenge in itself because they don't have the protection of a herd, right? And there's a lot of predators out there. And the thing about the predators is, like lions, they can reproduce a lot faster than elephants. And so after 6 years, there could be a lot of lions, and there's only 3 elephants. And they all have to survive. I mean, if any one of these dies, well, if the female dies, it's all over. But if the male dies, well, that's a problem too, right? So they have to survive for 4 or 5 years after the flood in a very chaotic environment. The post-flood world must have been totally crazy for a variety of reasons. And yet they had to survive, and they had to have offspring, and they better have had female offspring. So after 6 years, we only have 4 elephants now, a 5-year-old and a newborn, and 2 adults. 11 years, so 5 years later, we have a 3rd offspring. Let's say it's a male now. At this point, there are 5 elephants on the face of the earth. So 11 years have gone by. All right, 11 years, and there's still only 5 elephants on earth. All right, that would be all together. So you have a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old females, and you have a newborn male. All right, now you still only have 1 mom, 1 female that's able to get pregnant after the 11th year. After 16 years, there would be a 15, a 10, a newborn females, and a 5-year-old male, because we're going to say 3 out of the first 4 births were female. Around this time, the ark male would impregnate the oldest daughter, and so 2 females would be pregnant at the same time, right? Because at this point, you have another female, the first offspring, is now more than 13 years old, and so the male can impregnate both mother and daughter. And that results in 2 pregnancies. So after 21 years, you're going to look around and you're going to have 2 more elephants that are born. And hopefully they're both females. And so you're going to have 8 total elephants. All right, 21 years. That's a long time. All right. That's a long time to say that all these animals had to survive, right? They cannot afford to lose a single individual. And if they all survive, you have 8 elephants. Now, where are they going to be? Are these in Africa? Are they in Asia? Are they in England? Are they in England? Are they in Europe? I guess they could be any of those places. 20 years, they could travel a long way. Elephants can migrate large distances. Or they could have hunkered down in one area because everything was fine in that area. There's no necessary reason for them to migrate if they have all the things that they need in one particular spot. Nonetheless, I would expect that they would all be together, right? They haven't split off, right? They can't split off because you can't split off, and a male can't go one way and a baby can go another way, and so forth. They're not a reproductive unit. A reproductive unit of elephants needs to be a herd of elephants, and partly the herd is for protection as well. So you have to grow to a certain population size in order to assure your own safety and to increase the efficiency of the whole thing. All right, now I'm not going to go on after 21 years. I'm going to show you what happens if you use the manipulatives and the parameters provided. And you say, okay, you calculate out, you just start mapping out like after these different generations. After 50 years, you get up to, you finally have 22 elephants after 50 years. So 50 years after the flood, the world's this nice, toasty, warm place for the first 100 years. In the first 50 years, they got, plants galore, and it's a warm environment. It's great growing conditions, but nonetheless, about the max they can get to is 22 individuals, despite abundant resources. And 22 individuals, they're probably still living all together in one population. And I wouldn't even consider that, so that's one species. Now, maybe some of them look different than others. So it's like, yeah, I got a mastodon daughter and I got a mammoth son, right? And it's like in the same population. All right. And so the population genetics are also weird here too. If you're going to consider that you got to make 100 species here within the first 100 years. I don't know how you're going to do it when you only have 22 individuals after 50 years. Well, exponential growth is an amazing thing, right? So what you'll find is that after 65 years, you have 44 individuals. And so what the assignment does is it also asks you to calculate what the doubling time is. And so you have to actually map this all out. And then you're basically looking for where the populations double. And so you find where the population doubles, and then you divide by the years between doublings, and you figure out that it's about 15 years. All right, so it takes about 15 years to double your population. So you go from 22 to 44, but then in 15 years, you go from 44 to 88. All right, and then in another 15 years, which is a little beyond the 100, you're going to go to 160. No, I'm sorry, you're going to go to 88, 15, it's 90 something, so you get up to 170 or so, and then you're going to double after that. So after 200 years, after 100 years, you end up with about 200 elephants. 200 total elephants on the face of the earth. And with 200 elephants, you could imagine them dividing into several different populations. And if you wanted to think of each population now as being isolated from each other, they could then begin to change their genetics in different environments. You could say, well, that could be splitting into like 3 different species, maybe 4 different species after 100 years. All right, we already have a problem because that's not nearly the rate at which speciation needs to occur. It needs to occur much faster to explain the actual observations. So once again, we started with 2 elephants and we're covering the world. Okay, let's look at this again, but I made a little graphic. And it goes a little something like this. You got your two elephant-like things on the arc, 2,350 BC. 11 years later, you've got 5 elephants. All right, you've got 5 elephants. 10, 5, and a newborn. And then another 10 years later, we have 8 elephants total. So that's 21 years into it, we've got 8 elephants. After that, we might say, okay, look, we've got 8 elephants. We can split those, and 2 of them now have grown to the point where they're mature. So we have a male and a female that are now sexually mature. And so we can have them go off on their own, all right? And let's say those two kids were a little bit different than the others. And so send them off, and they're going to start migrating north, and they become different, and we'll say that those are going to become mastodons. Whereas the other ones are going to be more like elephas, which is one of the genera of, I think that's Asian elephant. All right, so we got two groups of elephants now. Now, the thing about it is once you send two off, there's only two of them, and you're really starting over again, right? You're starting as if you got off Noah's Ark for that particular species. Population growth resets because you only have two. Now, how are you gonna get three? Well, we're gonna have to wait, a few years. So if we wait another 10 years, 10 years later, we now have four elephants again. All right, and those four elephants are the elephants that are mastodons. All right, and let's say that they're migrating. Right, they got this homing sense somehow that they need to head north, and they need to eventually end up in North America. So they're heading up across Siberia, and every year they're making their way a certain distance. And so fine, right? Maybe they're traveling hundreds of miles each year. And you could theoretically, again, you could say, yeah, they could walk that far. In the space of 50 years, sure, absolutely. Maybe even 20 years. They could go all the way across Siberia, all across the Bering Strait, or swim across there, get to North America, and go to Kentucky. All right. They'd have to really be hoofing it, but and why they wouldn't stop where everything was perfectly fine and great for raising your young. They were just like, oh, we got to get to that other location. But the thing is, they also have to leave elephants behind because there are remnants of elephants in all these different places along the way and all over North America. Okay, anyway, whoops, wrong direction here. Another 10 years later, so you have 8 mastodons. Well, this is really 42 years, right? 42 years after the flood, you only have 8 mastodons. All right, and we're getting close to we only have 100 years really to get to Greenland, because after 100 years, the ice age is beginning, and that particular location is not going to be compatible with the life for a mastodon. But there's only 8 mastodons. So if somebody would like to argue that the mastodons in Greenland, got there within 100 years, then it's like the single population of mastodons, they went directly to Greenland, did not, didn't pass go. They just went straight there, right? They just never stopped anywhere, didn't leave any other behind, and took their entire population all the way to Greenland. Because by the time you get to, let's do it. Before I get to that, the other population stayed somewhere else, and it begins to grow. And then once it grows enough, it could then divide into 2 populations. And maybe those 2 populations become, say, woolly mammoths versus Asian elephants or something like that. All right, so what I'm trying to show you is there's sort of like these speciation events. But the speciation events have to occur within small groups of populations. So these are all problems because, honestly, it's not a good idea for elephants to split off. I'm just going to be 2 elephants. I'm going to wander off as a pair. And besides, behaviorally, this doesn't really make sense of the way elephants behave today. So you'd have to argue that they behave differently in the past, because really the males are more solitary and they're going to look for mates versus pairing up as if they're have a dedicated partner that they're going to stick with, because they would have to, because there is no other pair, right? I mean, there is nothing else to mate with at that time. And protection, right? You're alone in a world filled with predators. And not only that, you're in a world filled with all kinds of other dangers, like tsunamis, volcanoes, massive floods. The post-flood world for those first couple hundred years leading up to the Ice Age were incredibly hectic by all young Earth creationist models. That fraught with danger and many, many chances to be killed. And so all these models really depend on every single individual surviving, right? You knock out just a couple, especially if you lose a couple females. If you lose a couple females within the first 50 years, you're knocking back your population growth by another 100 years, right? It's going to take you another 100 years to get to where you were going to go in the next 20 years. So here we go with this would be exponential growth. This is theoretical maximum possible growth rate. So after 42 years, I was saying there's 8 mastodons. If you allow that mastodons weren't on the ark and that they had to diverge from another population, and that's actually the Answers in Genesis model. They were saying after 100 years, I'm giving them that after 42 years. Actually, after only 20 years, I'm saying that they've divided and became mastodons. And after 42 years, there were 8 mastodons. And then 57, there's 16, 72, there's 32, and then 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, and so forth. And when you get up to, here we are at how many years? 100 years. We have 128 mastodons. 100 years later, there's just 128 mastodons. And then when you get up to 200 years, which would be kind of like the max amount of time before you really have the ice age is well underway now. And now you have all those sites in northern North America where we have mastodons, fossils, but they're in ice age sediments, all right? The ice age has covered them over. And so they all have to be contained within that. I would say that, at 200 years, 16,384 mastodons. I don't think we have that many. I'm not sure. I'll say that we're probably close to actually having that many fossils of that many individuals of mastodons. And what are the chances if we've actually found all the fossils? Extremely slim, right? We've only found a small fraction of the total fossils of organisms that have lived. The irony here is that young Earth creationists kind of need us to have found all the post-flood fossils, because otherwise they have a massive population problem. Because based on the fossils we have found, there's well over 3,000 different locations where elephant fossils have been found. And some of those locations, there's 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 elephants found at those locations. So we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of actual individual fossils of elephants that have been discovered, of which the vast majority are found in locations that are older than the last ice age, all right, are older than the biblical ice age. And so you have to get to tens of thousands. Well, here at 200, we're only at 16,000. And that's just to get to the ones that we actually see, right? We actually have observational evidence for, which Ken Ham loves observational evidence, right? But inference would tell you that we could not possibly have found them all, right? The vast majority have been destroyed. They've been decayed. We'll never find them. They're in locations that we'll never see, all right? If we have found 1 out of every 1,000, I would be surprised, all right? And if it's 1 out of every 1,000, that means there were millions around when the ice age hit. And yet here, theoretically, only 116,000 at 200 years past the flood. Now, of course, if you move to 300 years after the flood, now you're talking 500,000 mastodons. Now, as each one of these different species split off, other ones are going to split off later, right? And so African elephants and so forth, if they split off later, they're getting a later start because they're going to start with just 2 or 3 or 4 individual elephants. And therefore, they're going to have to wait another 200 years before they themselves get to 16,000. Imagine the mammoths, right? If Answers in Genesis is right, the mammoths only show up after 200 years. Then it's going to take another 300 years after that for them to get to 500,000. But 300 years later is after the ice age. But where are most of the mammoths found? In Siberia, in North America, northern areas, in ice age deposits. And how many are found? Oh, the number of mastodon, actually I lied before, right? Because I was just talking about tens of thousands have been found. But if you include the number of tusks, which represent individuals, right? Which isn't in the paleo database, right? So all those dots, you didn't see like bazillions of dots in Siberia, but that's because they're not counting all the locally found tusks that are pulled out and sold. There are millions of tusks. I don't think there can be any doubt that there are millions of tusks of elephants that are in ice age deposits. And so mammoths would have had to have grown from 200 years after the flood to millions within 50 to 100 years. That's just not possible. It's just not possible. And I know theoretically, if you look at it and say like, oh, well, if mammoths were on the ark, then they got off the ark and then they started to populate, they could get to 524,000 by 300 years, which is right about the middle of the ice age. And then if you keep on doing this, of course, 500,000 would be a million 15 years later, and then 2 million, and then 3 million, 4 million, then 8 million. And sure enough, when you get to 400 years, you're talking 150 million, right? 200 million. And then it's like, yeah, it all fits in. Now, that assumes, of course, that you can continue that kind of incredible growth rate, because you're going to have problems with competition and spacing and all that when you start talking about populations increasing by 1 million in 1 year. We just don't see that right today in large animal populations. They're not going to increase that frequently. Remember, all of this is theoretical maximum stuff. Right? We're assuming that every elephant female, as soon as she's ready to be pregnant, actually, in fact, does get pregnant. And she has a successfully born offspring. Right? There is if elephants are like human beings, there's probably a 30 to 50% chance that they're going to miscarry. And I'm sure they're not that different in terms of the miscarry rate. But let's say it's only 20% miscarry. If I incorporate 20% miscarry into this particular model, then instead of having 500,000 elephants, all right, after 200 years, you're only talking about having, I think it was 260,000. Or you're going to have that. It sounds like only 20% would be cut off, but because you're losing elephants early on, you don't get the exponential growth from them, and therefore you lose a lot more than 20%. So you add on to that predation. You add on to that lightning strikes. You add on to that, terrible flood, which might kill an entire herd at one time. You're going to lose a lot of individuals. So at some point, when you add up miscarriage and all these other things, you're saying like, well, actually, it's more like 30% off of the theoretical max, rate. And so rather than doubling rates being every 15 years, that makes the doubling rate only every 25 years. And then if you have the doubling rate every 25 years, you're going to have to wait 400 or 500 years, all right, before you're going to get to your million mammoths, right? And that's just mammoths. Dinotherium, there's probably 1 million dinotheriums as well in the fossil record. And then there's gomphotheres. And then there's, then you have mastodons, of course. And then you got Asian elephants, American elephants. Then you have the stegosaurs. Sorry for getting the name of the little guys. Stegodons. Right? And then there's 100 other species, which we don't know how populous they were. They might have been fairly rare, maybe isolated to particular locations. There are some species that are only known from certain islands. So diversified on particular islands. So what about migration issues too? I already mentioned this. Ocean levels were higher prior to the Ice Age. So there weren't any land bridges until the Ice Age. So you have a problem here. You need those mastodons and mammoths to be in North America and mastodons to be all the way up there in Greenland prior to the Ice Age. And yet the Ice Age is the explanation young Earth creationists use for how they got there. So that doesn't work. You're going to have to go to swimming hundreds and hundreds of miles. And what if you're swimming, and you only have a population of 4 and you got 2 babies with you, right? Are you really going to do that? And why? Why would you do that when you're already presumably in a land that has plenty of resources? And you can't even see what's off in the distance. It seems like a very unlikely scenario. And as I've been mentioning, chaotic post-flood environment, massive flooding everywhere. Again, especially at the beginning of the Ice Age, because they're suggesting that the oceans were hot or very warm, and therefore creating a lot of moisture. That moisture then is falling at extremely high rates on the land and eroding, because that's how they get the massive amounts of sediment. They're in the post-flood world. Because there's areas where there's hundreds of feet of sediment that is laid down after the flood and contains post-flood animals in it. And how do you get that? Through massive amounts of erosion caused by massive flooding. And so this is a chaotic, crazy environment. So lots of chances for disasters to kill elephants, and all of that lowers the growth rate, population rate too, or population growth rate. And then you have predation on small populations. They're more vulnerable when they're not in established territory. And the biggie, what about human beings? We know that human beings kill elephants today, and they've killed them in the past. And Native Americans, because Native Americans would have been getting to North America presumably at the same time as mastodons and mammoths if they're traveling across that land bridge. Now, in the conventional model, they were there long before in huge populations, and most of these lived before that. And it's only the waning last bits of the populations that may have been killed out or helped to be extinct, made extinct by humans entering the land. But for young Earth creationists, humans and mastodons and mammoths essentially are getting there around the same time. You have a small population with not a lot of protection. And we know human beings killed lots of other large animals. Why not those? But can you see, like, this would be a problem if you have a group of 3 or 4 mastodons and they've got to get from Alaska all the way to Greenland. And they got to run the gauntlet, right, of these human beings in the way, along with wolves and so forth. And so they can't afford to be killed by that. And look at younger creationists. What is their explanation for why we don't have dinosaurs today? One of them is that, like, all the dinosaurs got off the ark, and there was only 2 of each one of them. And a lot of them fell prey to predation and human beings, trophy hunters, and, you know, people wanting to kill things, right? And why not the elephants too? I mean, how did the elephants survive? Yeah. Okay, so that's my general pitch for how I think that young Earth creationists have a serious population growth problem with large-bodied animals like this, but especially the elephants, because they have one of the longest gestation times and longest times between producing offspring. And so that's the most obvious problem. And young Earth creationists can do things like Jeanson does, which is he assumes theoretical maximum values. He's like, well, they could have this many offspring. They could have this many. And he does the exponential growth thing, which is not the real world. It just isn't the real world. And it certainly isn't the world that young Earth creationists describe. Not to mention genetic entropy and other things that they ascribe to, which suggests that they would not be able to be capable of maximum reproduction. All right, so theoretically, right? Theoretically, 2 elephants could make 1 million elephants, right, in 350 years. And maybe if you want to really push it, because you might say maybe they were a little bit smaller and maybe their gestation time wasn't quite as long originally, maybe you could push 1 million elephants into 300 years. But even if you did, right, there's 100 different species of elephants, of which multiple species probably had 1 million different elephants. I told you at the very beginning that it's estimated that there is some 20 million African elephants alive, not just more than a couple hundred years ago. And so when you consider the number of elephants that were alive at any one time around the Ice Age, when you consider all the different species that were around and the numbers of fossils they left at the numbers of different sites, you have to consider the possibility that there was 100 million elephants alive on Earth at one point. In the young Earth creationist viewpoint, not very long ago. All right, it kind of doesn't matter in terms of exponential growth explaining what's alive today. The question is, how do you explain how many were alive when you needed them to be alive, which is very soon after the flood. And so when you combine diversification, which I haven't even gone into the population genetics of that, which is totally crazy, because that should actually slow down population growth too as they're sorting themselves out, because you're going to have individuals that aren't going to be very compatible between those different species, and how they sort that out in a population such that ones are migrating separately from each other and adapting. That's a sticky wicket too for young Earth creationists. And if we were to get into all that, we would see that that's going to create more problems for how the populations are growing and spreading across the landscape. All right, I just want to let you know that I'm done with the bulk of my material. Right, I'm done sort of laying out the basic case. And so I have just a few more slides, but they're just going to be making the same points, but with some other data. And so I'm gonna hit a couple other papers and other data. But if you're like, hey, I got you, Joel. You know, I kind of get what you're saying. I don't need any more evidence. Then you don't need to watch what I'm going to say next. But here we go. Let's go back to North America. This is just a picture of all the different sites which are in the paleo database, or paleobiology database. And it certainly does not include every single site known. But nonetheless, you can see there's a lot of dots here. All right, and the dots include a lot of different habitats, at least a lot of different habitats that you might think of today. Not necessarily that. It could be when the elephants lived in those particular locations, the habitats were very different. And these dots go all the way down into Central America and then eventually go into South America. This is including mammoths and mastodons. And mastodons are found throughout, not quite as far north usually. And then you have mammoths, and like the woolly mammoth, more adapted for northern climates. There's a lot of sites. And all of these sites, every single one of them, obviously, a few mammoths, right, may have lingered after the most recent ice age. All right. It's thought that they're all gone by about 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, which is sort of the tail end of the ice age. And the last ones might have been knocked off by, say, Native Americans. All right, but those would be the very, very first Native Americans entering into North America. So in the young Earth creationist timeline, again, I think we could go through a number of these different sites and look at the geological context, and we could say, oh yeah, I can see that these fossils are found in sediments that would have been put down before the last ice age or somehow during the last ice age. So therefore, all these different, almost every one of these sites represents individuals that existed in these locations in the young Earth creationist time context within 400 years after the flood. So they had to have all gotten here. They had to have populated these areas. They would have spread. They had populations throughout the entire North American continent. And these are just the places we know about. Right? Like I said, I'm sure that we've only found 1,000th of the different actual localities in which there are mammoths preserved in the ground underneath us. Here is South America. So here's a paper on the diversity of the fossil Gomphotheres, which are a different clade of a very, very interesting group of pachyderms. And there's two different genera that live down here. So these are not mammoths and these are not mastodons. These are the ones that have, one of them's called the shovel tusks, and the shovel tusks had two teeth that, rather than pointing straight out for a long way or curling down or curling out, they had two elongated teeth together that were kind of like a shovel in front of them. And they also had kind of an elongated jaw. And it's thought that they had some kind of snout too. So, I mean, they're definitely elephant-like, and we consider them to all be part of the same group with the different proboscideans. And there's multiple locations within South America, which isn't the most, well-studied place. And also, it only has limited areas where you're going to have a good fossil record actually preserved. And so the fact that we have multiple locations, dozens and dozens of locations where these elephants are found, mean that in the history of South America, there must have been a lot of elephants living in this entire continent at some point, or I would say in the conventional dating scheme, over long periods of time. There may have only been hundreds of thousands of elephants at any one time, but maybe over 5 million years, there might have been hundreds of millions of elephants, of which we only have these ones that we have found preserved for us. And so all of these would have had to have somehow gotten here, right? And what are they related to? Well, if they're related to other elephants, they must be related somehow, maybe to mammoths, or mastodons, or as some creationists might say, maybe they're a different kind. If they're a different kind, then you have a different kind of problem, And the problem is the gomphotheres are only found in South America and just a little bit up into Central America. And so whatever gave rise to these, if these were on the ark, if there was 2 of these on the ark, then they made their way all the way to South America and didn't leave anything behind on the trip. All right, they didn't branch off. They didn't diversify. They didn't leave any other populations anywhere else, and they just homed in on South America as the place to live. And then you've got a bunch of elephants, and I'm just showing you that elephants were everywhere. They literally were everywhere except Australia. Many of the islands of Greece and off of Turkey have remains of elephants. And so there are hundreds of sites where elephants are found there as well. So just in this archipelago of islands. Now, what this graphic is showing is that these arrows represent where the migrations might have been. So how did they get to this island? Probably from up here. And how did they get to all these different islands? Well, you could say they could swim, because elephants are very good swimmers. But they didn't necessarily have to swim. See, if you go back to the last ice age, when the Mediterranean Sea was much lower, most of these islands are connected to each other. And so this, again, would be, if they got there by migration, all of these different elephants had to migrate onto these different islands. In order to do that, they would have had to have migrated to the various edges of Turkey and to Greece, right? Which itself is quite a trip. And then been available to be able to migrate during the short time in the younger creationist timeline. You only got like 100 years to figure it out, get over to that island. And then the waters rise and they get stuck on those islands. And you'll see there's a bunch of small elephants here, right? And these are like little miniature. These are considered elephants that have been, they were large and then they become smaller over time. And I had a really interesting paper, I forgot to include it in here. It talks about the dwarfism rate, like how fast can a large animal be dwarfed, and looking at progressions on different islands where the islands are different sizes, and on large islands they didn't dwarf as much as on small islands. And there's a bunch of theories for why. The smaller the island, the smaller the individuals. Primarily, you can say that it comes down to resources, availability, but there's also having something to do with the number of predators, all right, the number of dangers that exist for them. And on small islands, there's really not that many dangers. But then again, there's not a lot of food. But because of the length of time it takes for individual elephants to reproduce, elephants aren't just going to make more elephants and to put it in Guliuz's terminology, they don't track the environment, look at their environment. Oh, I'm on a small island. I think I'm just going to kick out an elephant that's not going to grow, going to grow half the size. You can do those experiments, I suppose, and I don't think that what you're going to find is if you put 2 elephants on an island, I don't think they're going to make small elephants within the first generation or the second generation or the third generation. And so after 100 years, you might have 40 elephants. Now, what you'll have is you'll have some small variation, right? This is the way population genetics works. You'll have some variation. Some elephants will be slightly smaller than their parents. Some might be a little bit larger. The ones that are a little bit smaller don't need quite as much resource. And if they're living in a resource-poor environment and they have genetics for basically conserving energy a little bit more and not putting it into mass, because really elephant size mass it's a defensive mechanism. And if there aren't any lions around, you don't need to be that large. It takes a lot of energy to maintain that mass. So if you live in a warm environment and you don't need to protect yourself, being smaller, there's nothing wrong with it. Whereas being larger might be a handicap, especially if you have hormones that are telling you I need to grow, but there's no food around. And so smaller elements might have a slight advantage. And so those smaller ones are more likely to survive. Maybe the smaller ones can survive, females can survive longer over a period of 60 years. And maybe the larger ones only survive for 50 years, in which case they have more offspring. If they have more offspring, they're going to share their genetics with the next generation. The next generation is going to be a little bit smaller. But okay, so they go through the genetics and they do some molecular biology, because we actually have DNA from a lot of these, because they're not that old, 20,000 to 50,000 years old. And we have DNA genomes from a lot of these organisms. And so we can look at their genetics. And what we find is that, they might have gotten a couple millimeters to a centimeter smaller, shorter each year, each generation. All right. But a generation of elephants is some 25 years or so for a generation. You calculate that out, and you're looking at, thousands of years in order to dwarfize an elephant down to a little small mini version of an elephant. And yet all of these were extinct before people really ever came to these islands. Well, when did people come to these islands? Probably 500 years after the flood, 600 years after the flood. Not very long afterwards. There's long histories of civilization on these various islands, and yet no evidence of living elephants on any of them. But there's obviously fossils, all right, subfossils of all these elephants on these islands, and yet they're dwarfs. All right, so how did they get to be dwarfed? If they're elephants that are the descendants of the elephants that gave rise to elephants around the rest of the world, it's very reasonable to assume they're like basically average-sized elephants. But yet some of them are tiny on these islands. And there's large numbers of tiny ones on there. It's not like they were just a mutant version. They were a population. They were probably healthy individuals that were small. That takes a lot of generations, and there just isn't enough time for all those generations within the young Earth creationist timeline. This is that paper, estimating the dwarfing rate of an extinct Sicilian elephant. And in that paper, they're looking at the DNA from a straight-tusked elephant, which is what these dwarfs are related to, from Germany. But straight-tusked elephants grew in this whole area here, right? We have fossils from Europe was just run over with elephants at one point. And yet, again, human history, in terms of recorded history, we don't know about any elephants. So all those many elephants that lived in Europe had to have grown in population, filled the entire European landscape, and then all gone extinct before humans migrated into that area. Not much time there. In this paper, they compare DNA sequences, and what they find is, based on the amount of DNA difference, they estimate that's like 300,000 years between when the animals were living on the continent and when they must have gotten to the island. And then since that time, they've gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time. It didn't necessarily take them that long to get small. Maybe it only took them 50,000 years to get small. And then they just lived at that smaller size for that amount of time. Oh, and then here's the molecular phylogeny showing, the ones on the island are not the same as here are 3 different elephants that are found. They're straight-tusked elephants that we have mitochondrial genomes for, that are from Europe, different places in Europe. And they're all really similar to one another. And these ones on the islands are fairly different, and yet they're more similar to those straight-tusked elephants, and also their morphology is very similar, so they've always been known to be closely related. And now that we have DNA sequence, it shows, yes, they are, in fact, actually closely related, but they're not exactly the same. And the amount of difference here is indicative of, as you can see here, approximately 350 to 500,000 years of differences, of divergence. Okay, last story, and I've saved one that I've written about numerous times. So you can go to my blog, thenaturalhistorian.com, and search for mastodons and elephants, and you'll find at least 3 long blog posts about this. So there are mastodons and mammoths in Colorado, and one particular spot is near Aspen, all right, a famous skiing area, high elevation area, right? And this arrow is pointing to there's actually a ski resort here. But next to the ski resort on a ridge, there is a lake. You heard me right. On the ridge, there is a lake. And here's what it looks like. So here we have these ski slopes. And then on this ridge right here, there is this lake called the Ziegler Reservoir. Now, they're calling it a reservoir, but in fact, it is a natural lake. They've blocked it up a little bit in order to preserve the top layer to get more water to stay in it. But it is a natural lake. There's a natural basin right here. And you may wonder, like, how in the world do you get a basin on the top of a ridge? And it all has to do with past ice ages, like long past ice ages. Remember, there's multiple ice ages. And one of those ice ages, there was a massive amount of ice in the valley, and it basically shoved a whole bunch of sediment up on one side, up the ridge, and created a pile, which then created a little a hollow here, which eventually filled with water. And there's very little area that actually feeds into this. In other words, there's no stream that feeds into this lake. There's a very small basin for which the water comes from. And so it wasn't necessarily always full of water. It was just a basin, a wet area that could have filled up with water and then during drier times dried out. And so there's a whole issue of quaternary research from 2014 that's multiple papers on this site, and it's called the Snow Mastodon Project. And what is found there is not just mastodons, but mastodons and mammoths. And this is at 9,000 feet in elevation. All right, 9,000 feet in elevation. And what's cool about this site is here is a cross section of the lake. All of this rubble right here represents moraine. And moraine is like the material that when a glacier shoves stuff in front of it or melts back and leaves a pile of rubble. That's moraine material, and it's just broken up bits of other rocks and other sediments. So this isn't like bedrock of the mountain. This is like a pile of rubble on one side of the lake. And then, so you had this lake, which actually is, this is in meters. So we have, I'm trying to remember here, we have 20 meters, so like 60 feet of sediment. So there's a whole bunch of sediment in this lake. Now, first of all, think about how long it would take to get the sediment in the lake, right? The lake had to have formed, let's think as a young Earth creationist. There's a giant flood. And then after the flood, there's like this mountain building. Somehow these Colorado mountains are built up. And then there's this ridge in the mountains as everything's eroding. But then there's an ice age. Now, wait a second. I don't know how to fit the ice age in, because the problem here is that there were also ice ages after the lake existed. This is one of the problems of the younger creationists. They want to say there's a single ice age, but you run into locations where it's like you need multiple ice ages in order to try to explain the observations you make. So one ice age or one period of massive amounts of ice in Colorado explains the origin of the actual lake itself, which is hard to explain as being made by a flood, by a massive global flood. It seems like a post-flood event to have a lake sitting up on a ridge. All right, so then you have the lake. The lake is sitting there, and it's just getting a little bit of sediment at a time, and then like trees grow up around it, and they're putting organic material in it. And you'll see that these different colors represent different sediments. So there's various kinds of silt and various types of sediment that represent different periods of time in which there was probably different things located around the edges of this basin. Right, so the basin at times might have been surrounded by a forest, right? But it might have been a forest of different types, or it might have been more barren, right, when it's much, much colder. And so the fact that you have different layers of sediments that have different kinds of plants in them, that have different kinds of sediments themselves, coarser versus finer, suggests that you have the climate changing over time. And these aren't annual changes. These are many years of the same kind of thing happening, in this area. And so what's cool here is you have things like bison and mastodons way down here in the bottom. And you got a lot of mastodons, actually. So a bunch of mastodons got stuck in this lake, died near the edge of this lake, and their bones eventually got covered with sediments as this thing filled in. And then you have series of periods of time in which you have no evidence of like a lot of fauna, just a few plants. And so it seems like, things got colder. And then you have a later time where, hey, you got, well, actually this one right here says vertebrate fauna, not there. And then up here at the top, you've got mammoths and a variety of different kinds of bison. And mammoths, there's a lot of mammoths, right? There's like dozens of mammoths found in this particular lake. So once again, you have to have, and these are recreations of different periods of time. So here's your mastodon down here. And up here, and also ground sloths, right? So a really wild set of organisms way up here at 9,000 feet in elevation at this particular site. And so here it's showing the basin, which at times was just a meadow and sometimes has been a lake. And sometimes been surrounded by evergreen trees, all right? So maybe some evergreen trees that are like at the very top of like where they can grow. And then other times the climate has been warmer, and so deciduous trees have been growing around, like aspen trees have been growing around this particular spot. And they know that from taking columns through here, and you can see all the different types of pollen and so forth. All right, so this one little spot tells a story of many, many changes, many different environments that have occurred. The thing is that all of this has happened. If you look at the like carbon-14 and other types of dating, this has all happened before the last ice age. All right, since the last ice age, it's been a lot colder in Colorado. And although there's, there are trees there today, and the whole thing's kind of basically filled in at this point. So it's a very different landscape it is today. But all the evidence of these organisms is suggestive of a time before the last ice age. So once again, you have to have mammoths and you have mastodons. And they actually didn't live there at the same time. They're actually separated by a good amount of sediment. We're talking, as I said before, 60 feet of sediment. And where does the sediment come from? There's no easy explanation for how you get a lot of sediment in this basin, right? Where's it going to come from? And if it rains really hard, stuff is rolling off the outside of this basin, out of the basin. The only stuff going into the basin is this little ledge around the edge, and so some stuff erodes and goes down in the base. It's not very much, all right? You're going to get a very tiny amount of sediment per year going into the basin. That's why it's thought that this basin represents 50,000 years, right, of accumulation. So, young Earth creationists have to have the mastodons have to have come across to North America before the Ice Age, right? And then settled and climbed all the way up this valley to get to this 9,000 foot location, and to have lived around here long enough to have left multiple different individuals in this location. And what do you think the chances that every one of them that died there are the only ones that are part of that population? No, they think that what they did was they migrated up here during the summer. So they migrated up here in the summer to higher elevation, and then they migrated down during the winter, and then they came back up, and they probably did this for, they're on a cycle, the ecosystem, probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's specific locations like these, when you start working through the details and figuring out like how would you explain within this very short time frame. There's a very short window of time in which all these things had to occur, right? These forests had to grow. Well, it takes 50 years, maybe for 75 years for a developed forest to occur. Then the forest is gone. And then you have a meadow, and you have other types of plants. You have spruce trees there. And then the spruce trees are gone, and then you've got these other kinds of trees growing there again. Just to replace those things that many times, you're looking at hundreds of years, probably more than hundreds of years. But if you want to be thinking about it as fast as you possibly can happen, it's hundreds of years. And that just doesn't fit into the creationist timeline. That's it. That's all I've got to say about mastodons, mammoths, growth rate. I'm trying to think if I've forgotten anything. There's probably lots of things I've forgotten to mention. And we could go around and look at any one of dozens of additional sites, and we could examine like the specifics of those sites. But I don't think the story is going to change. There's a lot of mastodons, and there's a lot of mammoths that have lived in North America, much less adding up all the other ones that lived in other parts of the world. This is a big challenge for young Earth creationists to explain why and how they would migrate to where they're at now, and how these communities developed so quickly just to have disappeared as quickly as that. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there. So till next time, thanks for hanging out with me. Got some other things in store after this. I think I'm done talking elephants for a little while, but if something else comes out, of course, I'll probably jump back on it because I love talking about elephants. And maybe Thomas and I will get together sometime and hash this over and see if we can't pull out some more data from all our research on this, and maybe we can come up with, give me some ideas of things we might be able to write about in a more official way as some kind of publication on this. All right, thanks a lot. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.